I'm proud of you, you know that. I hope you do.
For over 3 decades, a soft-spoken man in a hand-knit cardigan sat down in front of camera, changed his shoes, and told an entire generation of children that they were special just the way they are. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood premiered in 1968 and quietly became one of the most influential programs in the history of American television. On the surface, it looked simple almost to a fault. A trolley that rang a bell, a cast of felt and fur puppets, a house with a fish tank, and a host who spoke slowly enough that even the youngest viewer could keep up. But underneath that gentle exterior was a show that took enormous risks, challenged social norms, and carried far more history, controversy, and hidden detail than most people ever realized. Today, we're digging into 15 facts about the neighborhood that even longtime fans might be hearing for the first time. Stick around, because number 1 alone shows just how quietly radical this children's show really was. Let's start with the moment that turned a plastic wading pool into a piece of civil rights history. It was the summer of 1969, and swimming pools across the United States were still flashpoints for racial tension. Public pools had been the site of violent confrontations as communities fought over desegregation, and the image of black and white Americans sharing the same water was, for many viewers, still shocking or even threatening. Fred Rogers didn't address any of that directly. Instead, he filled a small plastic pool with water on a warm day, took off his shoes and socks, and invited Officer Clemens, played by the classically trained singer Francois Clemens, to join him and cool his feet. The two men sat together, talked casually, and shared a towel afterward as if nothing about the scene required explanation. That was exactly the point. Rogers never lectured his audience about equality. He simply modeled it, calmly and without any sense of urgency, trusting that children watching would absorb the lesson without needing it spelled out. Decades later, long after the news cycle had moved on from pool integration battles, the scene was revisited on the show again, a quiet reminder that some lessons about basic human dignity still needed repeating. In an era when most television avoided anything resembling social commentary, a children's program did it with nothing more than 2 pairs of bare feet in a plastic pool. Long before he ever put on a cape and cowl, a young Michael Keaton learned how to run a television set on the floor of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. In the mid-1970s, Keaton was a local Pittsburgh performer trying to break into the industry, and one of his early jobs was working behind the scenes on the show. He helped build and move props, kept the production running smoothly, and, in one of the more charming footnotes of television history, was the person physically operating the neighborhood trolley for a stretch of episodes. He wasn't confined to the shadows either. Keaton occasionally appeared on camera, including a memorable turn as one of the acrobatic Flying Zucchini Brothers during a circus-themed episode. Years later, after his career had carried him through blockbuster films and into the role of one of pop culture's darkest superheroes, Keaton spoke fondly about his time on The Neighborhood, describing Fred Rogers as one of the most consistently kind people he had ever worked alongside. It's a strange bit of trivia to sit with. The actor who would go on to play Batman's brooding intensity got his start quietly, pushing a wooden trolley across a soundstage for a man whose entire philosophy was the opposite of brooding. Fred Rogers had a peculiar and deeply personal relationship with the number 143, and it wasn't about superstition. For more than 30 years, he made a point of maintaining his body weight at exactly 143 pounds, stepping on a scale nearly every day to check. The reason had nothing to do with fitness culture or vanity. To Rogers, 143 was a kind of secret shorthand. 1 letter for I, for letters for love, and 3 letters for you. He treated the number almost like a private mantra, a daily physical reminder of the message he had built his entire career around. While much of the country was consumed by diet trends and body image anxieties, Rogers turned a mundane trip to the scale into something closer to a spiritual check-in. The idea resonated so strongly that the state of Pennsylvania eventually built an entire day around it. Every year in May, 143 Day is observed in his honor, encouraging people to perform small acts of kindness in the same spirit that quietly guided him for decades. The cardigan and sneaker switch that opened every episode is one of the most recognizable rituals in television history, but the sneakers in particular started out as a purely technical fix. During early tapings, the sound of Rogers walking across the studio floor in hard-soled dress shoes created an unwanted clatter that microphones picked up far too easily. Rather than deal with a constant echo problem, the production simply had him change into soft canvas sneakers once he stepped inside the set. It solved the audio issue instantly. What nobody anticipated was how powerfully that small wardrobe change would resonate with young viewers. Watching an adult unhurriedly swap his shoes became a visual cue that the noise of the outside world was being set aside and that this half hour belonged entirely to them. A practical solution to a sound engineering headache slowly transformed into one of the most emotionally significant rituals in children's programming, a daily signal that someone was slowing down specifically to pay attention. Many of the puppet characters that populated the neighborhood of make-believe felt like an entire ensemble cast, but the vast majority of those voices came from a single person. Fred Rogers himself performed nearly all of the puppets on the show, shifting his pitch, cadence, and personality to bring characters like the imperious King Friday 13, the anxious and gentle Daniel Striped Tiger, and the unpredictable lady Elaine Fairchild to life. Rather than hiring a large voice cast, the production leaned almost entirely on Rogers' own range. This wasn't simply a budget-saving decision. It gave him an unusual creative outlet. Through Daniel Tiger's timid questions, he could explore vulnerability and fear in a way that might have felt too exposed coming directly from his human character. Through King Friday's stubborn pronouncements, he could dramatize authority and rigidity. Through Lady Elaine's chaos, he could play with the idea of rule-breaking and change. Children watching had no idea they were listening to one man's cycle through an entire emotional spectrum. They simply experienced a neighborhood full of distinct personalities, each one secretly a piece of their host's own inner life. Those unmistakable cardigans weren't costume department creations at all. They were handmade by Fred Rogers' own mother, Nancy Rogers, who knitted each one herself and gave them to her son as gifts. On air, he would occasionally hold one up and explain to viewers exactly where it came from, treating the sweater not as a prop, but as a piece of family history he happened to be wearing on television. When Nancy Rogers passed away in 1981, that quiet, ongoing supply of hand-knitted sweaters came to an end, leaving the production with an unusual dilemma. How do you replace a wardrobe staple that was never manufactured in the first place, but stitched by hand out of love? By that point, the cardigans had become so closely tied to the show's identity that no store-bought replacement could have carried the same meaning. Today, one of Nancy Rogers' original sweaters is preserved in the Smithsonian, a small woolen artifact that represents far more than clothing. It stands in for an entire relationship between a mother and her son that ended up shaping how millions of children experience comfort on screen. One of the strangest and most touching moments connected to the show didn't happen on a television set at all. In 1998, researchers arranged a meeting between Fred Rogers and Coco, the gorilla famous for her use of sign language and her apparent emotional depth. Coco had reportedly watched recordings of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood many times before the visit. When Rogers arrived and sat near her enclosure, Coco did something nobody expected. She gently removed his shoes, mimicking the ritual she had seen him perform on screen countless times, before wrapping her arms around him and signing the word for love. It was a moment that no script could have planned. A gorilla, working entirely from observation and memory, had absorbed the emotional core of the show so thoroughly that she reenacted its most famous ritual back to the man who created it. For a program built on the idea that consistency and gentleness could create real connection, it was a strange and moving piece of proof that the message had gotten through, even to a viewer nobody had designed the show for in the first place. For years, a bizarre rumor circulated in schoolyards and later across the internet, claiming that Fred Rogers had secretly served as a decorated military sniper before his television career, with his cardigans supposedly hiding tattoos documenting his kills. It's the kind of legend that thrives specifically because it contradicts everything the public image suggested. Surely, the thinking went, nobody could really be that gentle without some hidden, darker history balancing out. In reality, Rogers never served in the armed forces at all. During the years when many young men his age were being drafted, he was pursuing seminary studies and beginning to develop his ideas about how television might be used to support children emotionally rather than simply entertain them. Some have speculated the myth grew out of confusion with another man who shared his name and did have a military record, while others suspect it emerged purely from a cultural discomfort with sincerity, a need to imagine some hidden edge behind a public figure who seemed to have none. The rumor's persistence says far less about Fred Rogers than it does about a culture that sometimes finds open kindness harder to believe than secret violence. The music running underneath every episode was far more sophisticated than most viewers ever consciously noticed. Rather than relying on pre-recorded stock cues, the production employed a live jazz trio led by pianist Johnny Costa, a musician so technically gifted he earned the nickname, the Bach of Mr. Rogers. Neighborhood. Costa and his bandmates played and improvised in real time during tapings, adjusting their tempo and tone to match the emotional beats of each scene as they happened. Warm chords accompanied reassuring dialogue, playful runs underscored the puppets' antics, and recurring musical motifs returned like familiar friends across episodes. For young viewers, it simply felt natural, part of the atmosphere rather than anything to analyze. For anyone listening closely as an adult, it was clear that Rogers had chosen to surround his message with genuine musical artistry rather than convenient production shortcuts. Without ever announcing it, preschoolers across the country were being introduced to real jazz, phrasing, and harmonic complexity, shaped by musicians who were essentially composing children's television in the moment. Fred Rogers received a staggering volume of fan mail throughout the show's run, and rather than delegate the task to assistants using form responses, he insisted on personally reading and replying to letters from children. Working alongside his longtime assistant, Elaine Crozier, he would go through anywhere from 15 to 30 letters on an average day, each one requiring individual attention. Some children wrote about ordinary things, favorite puppets, or questions about the trolley. Others wrote about genuinely difficult experiences, a parent's illness, a pet's death, a divorce at home. Rogers treated every single one with the same careful consideration, crafting responses that echoed the patient, honest tone he used on air rather than falling back on generic reassurances. In an industry built around broadcasting to as many people as possible at once, he carved out real time for one-on-one correspondence, turning a mass medium into something that could feel deeply personal to a single child holding a letter with his actual handwriting on it. Rogers didn't originally set out to make television at all, and in fact his earliest reaction to the medium was closer to discomfort than ambition. In the 1950s, children's programming leaned heavily on slapstick, pie-in-the-face gags, exaggerated pratfalls, and humor built around humiliation or chaos, often played entirely for laughs without any regard for how it might affect young viewers. Watching adults throw food at each other on live broadcasts left Rogers unsettled rather than entertained. Instead of writing television off as a lost cause, though, he decided to enter the industry and try building something fundamentally different from the inside. The slow pacing, long thoughtful pauses, and careful explanations that eventually defined his show weren't accidents or budget limitations. They were deliberate choices, a direct response to the frantic noise he'd seen dominate the genre. Where competitors chased attention through constant spectacle, Rogers bet that genuine presence and trust could hold a child's focus just as effectively, if not more so. In that sense, the entire show grew out of a kind of quiet protest against how children's entertainment had been treating its audience. Beneath the cardigan was a formal religious calling that most viewers never fully registered. In 1963, the Presbyterian Church ordained Fred Rogers as a minister, but rather than placing him in a traditional congregation, church leaders gave him an unusual assignment: continue his work in television and treat it as a genuine form of ministry focused on children's spiritual and emotional well-being. It was a recognition that television, for many families, had become a more consistent presence in daily life than any physical place of worship. On screen, Rogers rarely, if ever, discussed formal theology or doctrine. His ministry expressed itself instead through themes of self-worth, forgiveness, and compassion, delivered in language simple enough for any